Most of us have a compost bin or a pile down the back, or we mean to. But there's an older way of dealing with kitchen scraps that costs nothing, needs no equipment, and does its work in the one place you actually want it, right under your plants. You dig a hole, you drop your scraps in, you cover it over, and you let the soil do the rest. That's the whole method. It has a few names. Some people call it trench composting, some call it pit composting, some just call it dig and drop. And it was ordinary once, 30, 40 years ago, when nearly every back garden had a few rows of vegetables. Plenty of households buried their peelings straight into the beds. It wasn't a technique anyone made a fuss about. It was just what you did with the bucket under the sink. So today I want to talk about what's actually going on underground when you do that, what's worth burying and what really isn't, and how to do it in a way that helps your soil rather than causing yourself a headache. And I'll be honest with you along the way about the parts where the popular advice runs a bit ahead of the evidence, because there's a fair bit of that around this subject. Let's start with why it works at all, because that's the interesting part. When you bury a handful of vegetable peelings, you're not really feeding your plants directly. Plants can't take up a banana skin. What you're doing is feeding the living things in the soil, and they, in turn, hand the nutrients on in a form roots can use. A teaspoon of healthy garden soil holds an astonishing amount of life. Earthworms, yes, but also bacteria, fungi, and all sorts of small creatures you'll never see. When you bury soft green waste, you're setting a table for all of them. Now, you'll often hear this described as turning your garden into a giant worm farm, and worms certainly show up to the party. But I'd gently correct the picture a little, because it's not only worms doing the work, and underground it's not even mostly worms. Once material is buried and covered over, oxygen gets scarce down there, and a lot of the breakdown is done by bacteria that are perfectly happy in low oxygen conditions. That's actually a real difference between burying scraps and running a compost pile up top. A pile you turn and aerate because it works best with plenty of air. A buried trench works the other way. It's a slower, low-air process, driven by a different cast of microbes, with the worms moving in more as things soften and become easier to eat. The end result is similar. Your scraps become part of the soil. But it's worth knowing the mechanism, because it explains some of the quirks we'll come to, like why it can be slow and why you don't want to overdo it. The payoff, when it works, is soil that's darker, holds moisture better, and is genuinely alive with activity. And because all of that happens exactly where your roots will be growing, none of the goodness has to be carried anywhere. In an open compost pile, some of the nitrogen escapes into the air as the material breaks down. Buried in the soil, more of it stays put, held by the soil around it, waiting for the roots. That's a real advantage, and it's a fair reason to have this method in your kit. I'll say one thing plainly though, because you'll sometimes hear direct burial talked about as if it beats every other method, as if it's the shortcut that makes your compost bin redundant. I don't think that's the right way to see it. It's not better than composting. It's different, with its own trade-offs. A compost pile gives you finished compost you can lift and spread anywhere you like, around established plants, into pots, wherever. A buried trench enriches one specific spot, and nowhere else. It works more slowly, and it asks for a bit of spare ground. So think of it as another tool on the bench, one that happens to be free and very low effort, rather than a replacement for everything else. Right, let's talk about how you actually do it, because this is where a few small details make all the difference. You want to dig down a decent way, roughly a spade's depth, which is around 30 centimeters, or about a foot. You can get away with a little less, but I wouldn't go shallower than about 20 centimeters, and here's why. Depth is what keeps the peace. Buried a good spade deep and covered over firmly, your scraps are out of sight and out of smell. Animals can't detect much. The surface looks like ordinary soil, and nothing turns into a problem. Bury too shallow, and you're more or less inviting the neighborhood dog, or the foxes, or whatever digs where you are, to come and investigate. A couple of tips to speed things along. Chop or tear your scraps up a bit before they go in. Smaller pieces have more surface area for the soil life to get at, so a handful of chopped peelings breaks down noticeably faster than a whole cabbage stump left intact. And don't cram one spot full. It's tempting to dig one hole and tip a week's worth of everything in, But if you overload a small area, you can end up with a cold, soggy, airless pocket where things just sit and sulk instead of breaking down, and any plant sitting on top of that will struggle. Better to spread modest amounts across a few holes than to overwhelm a single one. Now here's the detail the old advice usually skips, and it matters. Don't plant straight on top of freshly buried scraps. While that material is actively breaking down, the process temporarily ties up nitrogen and can be a bit harsh on tender young roots. You'll sometimes hear it called nitrogen burn, so give it time. A sensible rule of thumb is to wait around 6 to 8 weeks between burying and planting over the spot. If you're burying in an empty bed at the end of the season and planting there next spring, that gap sorts itself out and you never have to think about it. But if you're doing this mid-season, just keep your fresh scraps a little away from the roots of anything already growing, and give a newly filled hole those few weeks before you sow into it. So what should go in? The easy answer is the soft, plant-based stuff you'd happily put in any compost bin. Fruit and vegetable peelings, cores and trimmings, coffee grounds, crushed eggshells, which break down slowly but add a bit of calcium, tea leaves, spent flowers, soft garden trimmings. All of that is ideal, and the softer and greener it is, the faster it disappears. Banana skins, for instance, are so soft they can be largely gone in a matter of weeks. Something tougher and more fibrous, like a corn cob, is a different story. Those are carbon-heavy and woody, and a cob can sit down there for a couple of months before it's properly hollowed out and reduced. That's not a fault, it's just the nature of the material. If you're burying a lot of dry, fibrous, brown material like that, it helps to mix in some of the soft green stuff with it, because that balance of green and brown is what keeps the breakdown ticking along nicely rather than stalling. And now the part where I have to be the one who spoils the fun a little, because the original idea I'm building this from was quite relaxed about burying meat, bones and fish, and suggested it's no trouble in small amounts. I'd push back on that, and here's my honest reasoning. A buried trench never heats up. A well-managed hot compost pile can reach temperatures high enough to kill off harmful bacteria, but a hole in the ground stays roughly at soil temperature. That means meat, bones and dairy buried in the garden can harbor pathogens like E. coli and salmonella that simply don't get destroyed. And you don't really want those sitting in the ground you're about to grow food in. On top of that, animal products are exactly what draws rats, foxes, raccoons and dogs. Their noses are far better than ours, and fatty, meaty scraps carry a scent that reaches through soil far better than a potato peeling does. Add in the smell if it goes properly anaerobic, and it's just more trouble than it's worth. So my genuine advice is to keep meat, bones, dairy and oily, fatty food out of your buried scraps. Stick to clean, plant-based material, and you'll essentially never have a pest or a smell problem. If you're set on composting meat and dairy at home, the method actually designed for it is bokashi, where you ferment it in a sealed bucket first and only then bury the pickled result. But that's a whole subject of its own for another day. Which brings me to fish, because there's a famous piece of garden lore here, and I want to give you the fair version of it. You've probably heard that if you bury a fish head under a tomato plant, you'll grow the finest tomatoes of your life. The story usually comes wrapped in a bit of history. The idea that Native Americans taught the early colonists to plant a fish with their corn. It's a lovely tale, and there is a real thread of truth in it, but I'll be straight with you. That particular origin story is more contested than it's usually presented. Some historians argue the practice may have been picked up from European farming rather than being a widespread native technique, and the evidence is genuinely mixed, so I'd hold the history lightly. What about the gardening claim itself? Well, fish does break down into real, useful nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium, all things a tomato is happy to have. So the basic principle is sound, but the results people report are far more modest than the legend suggests. In at least one careful side-by-side, the tomatoes planted over a fish head actually started out behind the ones grown in plain soil, greener in the leaf but slower overall, and only caught up later in the season. That's a long way from the best tomatoes you've ever seen. And remember, fish is still meat, so it carries every one of those cautions I just gave you. It needs to go deep, a good foot down, or something, or dig it up, and there's the same pathogen consideration. So by all means, treat it as an interesting old practice to experiment with if you're curious. Just don't expect a miracle, and don't take the folklore as settled fact. That's the evidence-honest version. Let's talk about space and rhythm, because this method does ask for a bit of room. Since scraps take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to vanish, and since you're not planting straight over them, you need somewhere to keep burying while last month's holes finish their work. If you've got a generous garden, that's no bother. If you're tighter on space, there's a tidy old system worth knowing, sometimes called the 3-zone or English method. You divide a bed, or a stretch of ground, into 3 strips. One strip is where you're burying scraps this season, one is where you're growing, and one is simply the path you walk on. Next season you rotate, the path becomes the growing strip becomes the trench, and so on. Over 3 years, every part of that ground has had its turn being fed, and you've enriched the whole bed without ever needing a compost bin or a spare corner. It's a genuinely elegant solution for a small plot. A word on climate, because timing here really does depend on where you are. Warm soil is busy soil. In a hot climate or through summer, buried scraps break down noticeably faster. Cold slows everything right down, and if your ground freezes solid in winter, the whole process more or less pauses until spring. So in cold regions, the classic move is to dig your holes or trenches in autumn while the ground is still workable, fill them over the colder months, and let them come good as the soil warms. In a hot, dry climate, the thing to watch is moisture. Soil life needs some dampness to function, so a trench in bone-dry ground will just sit there. A bit of water, or burying in a spot that stays reasonably moist, keeps things moving. Wherever you are, the principle is the same. It's only the pace and the timing that shift. One last thing you might wonder about, since I mentioned all that soil life. If you dig around an old trench, you'll often turn up fat white grubs curled in the soil, and people worry about those. Most of the big white curl grubs are the larvae of beetles, and while plenty of soil creatures are entirely helpful, some of those root-feeding grubs can chew on plant roots, so they're not always friends. If you find them, you can simply pick them out. But finding a soil full of worms and general activity around your old scraps is exactly what you want to see. It's the sign the whole thing is working and that your soil is alive rather than inert. So let me leave you with the one thing to try this week, and it costs you nothing but a few minutes and a spade. Find an empty corner of a bed, somewhere you're not currently growing anything. Dig a hole about a spade deep. Tip in a bucket of your soft kitchen scraps, the peelings, the cores, the coffee grounds, the eggshells, nothing meaty. Chop them up a touch if you can be bothered. Cover them over firmly with the soil you took out, and if you like, press a marker in so you remember where it is. Then simply leave it. Come back in 6 or 8 weeks and have a dig, and I think you'll be quietly impressed at how much has already turned back into ordinary dark earth. That's the whole idea in one small action, the cheapest soil improver there is, made from something you were about to throw away, working away right where you need it. That's burying kitchen scraps, done properly and honestly. If you found it useful, you know what to do, and I'll see you in the next